I kind of like Diddy.
The warning did not arrive as a press release. It arrived as a statement that felt deliberate, measured, and impossible to ignore. When someone with decades of insider access says they are ready to outgrow the biggest hip-hop documentary of the moment, it isn't noise. It's positioning. It's a signal that the story many believe has reached its climax may only be shifting direction. For years, hip-hop's most powerful names have existed inside a carefully managed balance. Success on the surface. Silence underneath. Moments that sparked controversy were framed as isolated incidents, disconnected from one another, safely buried under time, money, and influence. But documentaries change how memory works. They don't just revisit events. They rearrange them. What happens when the camera stops asking who did what and starts asking why certain stories never moved forward at all? The conversation is no longer about one individual. It's about proximity, about patterns, about who stood close, who benefited, and who remained untouched while others fell. In industries where access is currency, silence isn't neutral. It has value. The idea being raised now is not a verdict. It's a question. And questions are dangerous when they're finally asked out loud. Why do some names repeatedly appear on the edges of controversy but never at the center? Why do alliances survive scandals that destroy others?
I have released Diddy's documentary on Netflix, and I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, Beyoncé, Oprah Winfrey, Kim Kardashian, all of them were Diddy's handlers.
Why do narratives stall just long enough for attention to move on? This isn't about guilt. It's about structure. And structure is harder to dismantle than any single reputation. Halfway through this story, let me ask you something directly. If you believe power should be questioned no matter who holds it, make sure you're subscribed. Not because this channel claims answers, but because we follow the questions wherever they lead. Stay with us, because what comes next only makes sense if you've seen how the system works. For decades, the industry trained the audience to think in fragments. One lawsuit here, one rumor there, one headline that burns hot for a week and disappears forever. But when fragments repeat, when the same circles overlap, when the same defenses are deployed again and again, coincidence starts to feel like design. Silence becomes strategy. Distance becomes insulation. Loyalty becomes leverage. The most powerful shield is not innocence. It's complexity. Layers of business, layers of partnerships, layers of influence that make accountability feel impossible without tearing down more than just one person. That's why this moment matters. Because the conversation is no longer asking whether something happened. It's asking how much had to stay quiet for everything else to continue working. And once that question is asked, it doesn't go away. This story doesn't begin with accusations. It begins with access, with rooms most people never enter, with relationships that never appear in headlines but shape outcomes behind them. And now, for the first time in a long time, that access is being discussed openly, not to destroy, but to expose how silence was maintained. And once silence breaks, it doesn't matter who wanted it to last forever. Once you understand how power moves, the story starts telling itself. In every industry, there are visible stars and invisible architects. The visible ones take applause, blame, headlines, and heat. The invisible ones move quieter, protected not by secrecy alone, but by how normal their presence has become. Familiarity is camouflage. When someone is always there, people stop asking why. This is where narratives begin to bend. Friendships get labeled as coincidence. Business ties get reframed as history. Patterns get dismissed as timing. And slowly, a picture forms that looks harmless from a distance but unsettling when you step closer. The question isn't who attended which party, who sat next to whom, or who defended whom publicly. Those details are distractions. The real question is continuity. Who remained connected across decades of controversy? Who survived every shift in public opinion untouched? And who always seemed to land on their feet when others fell? Power doesn't announce itself. It stabilizes itself. When controversy erupts around one figure, the system instinctively protects itself by narrowing focus. One name absorbs all the attention. One story becomes the monster of the moment. Everything else goes quiet, and the audience, overwhelmed by volume, accepts the simplicity. But simplicity is never how real systems operate. Behind every public collapse, there are private calculations. Who needs distance? Who needs silence? Who needs to say just enough to appear moral without disrupting the structure? That's how influence survives storms, not by fighting them, but by redirecting them.
And this is why timing matters.
Allegations that surface years later don't exist in a vacuum. They collide with history, with old statements, with alliances that once seemed harmless, with defenses that made sense then, but feel different now. When someone publicly stood up for another during controversy, was it loyalty? Was it ignorance? Or was it protection of a larger ecosystem that couldn't afford disruption? Those answers don't live in courtrooms. They live in patterns. Look closely and you'll notice something else. When one figure becomes the center of outrage, the conversation about everyone else quietly pauses. The media moves on. The industry exhales, and the silence returns until it doesn't.
Because silence has a shelf life.
Every system that depends on silence eventually produces pressure. Pressure to explain. Pressure to justify. Pressure to reconcile past behavior with present reality. And when pressure builds long enough, even the quietest names start sounding loud. This isn't about rewriting history. It's about rereading it without blind spots. Moments once framed as isolated now feel connected. Decisions once excused as business now feel strategic. And relationships once ignored now demand context. The story is no longer about whether the industry knew something. It's about how much the industry required not knowing.
And once that realization sets in, the conversation can't go back to normal.
Because power that survives without scrutiny eventually invites it. And scrutiny doesn't care how long someone stayed untouchable. There is a moment in every long-buried story when the conversation changes tone. Not louder, not angrier, just sharper. That moment arrives when rumors stop floating and start landing next to records, timelines, and decisions that can no longer be brushed away as coincidence. When memories aren't just remembered, but compared. For years, the industry relied on confusion, conflicting accounts, blurred timelines, stories that felt dramatic but incomplete. Confusion is powerful because it delays judgment without demanding innocence. It keeps everything unresolved, and unresolved stories are easy to live with. But clarity is different. Clarity doesn't accuse. It aligns. When you place events next to each other instead of far apart, patterns emerge that were never meant to be seen together. Defenses that once sounded reasonable begin to contradict each other. Statements that felt confident at the time start aging poorly. And suddenly, the question isn't, is this true? It's, why does this keep repeating? Every system has a breaking point, and it's rarely triggered by a single revelation. It's triggered by accumulation. One story doesn't do it. 10 stories do, especially when they share the same power centers, the same gatekeepers, the same silence. The industry has always known how to handle scandals, contain them, isolate them, let time soften them. What it was never built to handle was context. Context connects dots without raising its voice. When someone speaks now, they aren't just adding a claim. They're adding weight. Weight to conversations that were once dismissed. Weight to people who were told their experiences didn't fit the narrative. Weight to moments that were explained away too quickly. And weight changes balance. That's why reactions feel different this time. Not frantic, but calculated. Statements are careful. Distances are measured. Silence is strategic again, but less confident than before. Because once context enters the room, silence stops feeling safe. It starts feeling loud. The public doesn't need to be told what to think. It needs enough information to notice inconsistencies on its own. And once people notice them, no amount of reputation can erase the question that follows. Why did this version of events survive for so long? Power answers that question without speaking. It answers it through who was protected, who was ignored, and who was asked to wait until the moment passed. But moments don't pass forever. They circle back, stronger, clearer, less forgiving. And when they do, they don't just challenge individuals, they challenge the systems that made those individuals untouchable in the first place. That's the shift happening now. Not from rumor to certainty, but from noise to structure. And once a story gains structure, it stops collapsing under pressure. It holds. There is a reason silence feels different depending on who uses it. For most people, silence is hesitation. For powerful systems, silence is a decision. It's chosen, measured, and often rehearsed long before it's needed. In moments of pressure, the loudest move is sometimes to say nothing at all. That's how stories stall. When questions surface, responses don't rush to deny them. They slow them down. Legal language replaces human language. Statements become carefully hollow. Nothing is admitted. Nothing is clarified. Time is allowed to do what it does best: dilute attention. And attention is the real battlefield. Public memory doesn't fail on its own. It's trained to move on. One headline replaces another. One outrage consumes the last. The system doesn't need to erase anything. It just needs to wait. But waiting only works when silence is uncontested. What changes everything is when silence starts being examined instead of accepted. When people stop asking, "Why aren't they responding?" and start asking, "What does this silence protect?" Because silence isn't empty. It's occupied. It occupies space where explanations should live. It occupies space where accountability might have been. And the longer it sits there, the heavier it becomes. For decades, silence was framed as dignity, as restraint, as professionalism. Those labels worked because they sounded reasonable. But they also discouraged scrutiny. They suggested that asking questions was rude, premature, or unnecessary. That framing is breaking now. Not because someone shouted louder, but because too many moments share the same absence of response. Too many controversies ended the same way. Too many people were told to wait, to trust, to stop asking. And trust, once stretched too far, snaps quietly. You can feel that snap in how stories are being revisited. Not with outrage, but with analysis. Not with claims, but with comparisons. The tone has shifted from emotional to structural. And structure is where silence struggles. Because structure asks for timelines, for consistency, for explanations that line up across years instead of weeks. Silence can delay one question, but it can't answer 10 at once. That's why this phase feels uncomfortable for power. There's no clear enemy to push back against, no single accusation to dismantle, just a growing awareness that the same playbook was used too often, for too long. And awareness doesn't fade easily. It sits with people. It reframes old interviews, old statements, old defenses. It makes the familiar feel questionable. Silence once suggested control. Now it suggests avoidance. And avoidance, when repeated, becomes its own story. A story that doesn't need narration. It reveals itself through what's missing. And once people start listening to what isn't being said, they rarely stop. At a certain point, the question stops being about individuals and starts being about design. Systems don't form by accident. They evolve through repetition, through what's tolerated, what's rewarded, and what's quietly ignored. Over time, behavior becomes culture. Culture becomes policy, and policy becomes protection. That's why the industry keeps returning to the same names, the same circles, the same rooms. It's not because nothing else exists. It's because those spaces learned how to survive scrutiny. They learned how to absorb shock without collapsing. When one pillar weakens, another quietly takes weight. And this is where patterns matter more than personalities. Look at how careers accelerate when proximity is granted. Look at how momentum slows when distance appears. Access opens doors. Distance closes them. This isn't conspiracy, it's economics. Influence flows where it's protected. When people speak about loyalty, they often mean survival. Loyalty doesn't always look like defense. Sometimes it looks like omission. Sometimes it looks like redirection. Sometimes it looks like letting someone else take the fall while the structure remains untouched. And structures hate disruption. They respond to it by isolating damage, by turning complex networks into single villains, by encouraging the public to believe the problem has a face, a name, an ending. But endings are dangerous for systems that rely on continuity. That's why stories are often framed as personal failures rather than institutional ones. Because institutions can't be arrested, they can't be canceled, they can only be questioned. And questioning them changes everything. Once people start asking who benefited when narratives stalled, the conversation deepens. Once they ask why certain relationships were never examined, the surface cracks. Once they ask why some voices were amplified while others were dismissed, the imbalance becomes visible. This isn't about rewriting success, it's about understanding the cost of it. Who paid it? Who absorbed it? And who never had to acknowledge it at all. The most unsettling realization isn't that wrongdoing may have occurred. It's that the system knew how to keep functioning regardless. That it learned how to adapt without reforming. That it kept producing icons while burying context. And now, context is catching up. Not through outrage, through persistence. Through people refusing to accept simplified stories anymore. Through audiences recognizing that patterns don't form without permission. Through an understanding that silence, access, and loyalty aren't separate forces, but parts of the same machine. Once you see the machine, you stop arguing about the noise it makes. You start asking who built it. Every era chooses its villain, not because the truth demands it, but because the system does. When pressure builds too high, attention has to land somewhere. A single figure becomes the symbol of everything wrong. The outrage feels justified. The headlines feel decisive. And the audience feels relief, because complexity has been reduced to a face. This is how systems protect themselves. By offering one story loud enough to drown out all the others. Once a villain is chosen, the rest of the structure gets a break. Questions slow down. Connections stop being explored. The public believes the problem has been identified, and the industry quietly resets around the damage. But there's a pattern to who becomes acceptable to fall. It's rarely the most insulated, rarely the most strategically positioned. It's usually the one whose removal won't collapse the network, the one whose absence can be survived without reform. That's why outrage often feels intense but temporary, because it's contained. Contained outrage doesn't threaten power. It feeds it. It creates the illusion of accountability while leaving the machinery untouched. The system appears responsive, even as it remains unchanged. And that illusion worked for a long time. Until people started noticing the rotation. Different names, same process, same silence around everyone else. Once you see that rotation, you can't unsee it. You realize that justice isn't avoided outright. It's rationed, carefully, strategically, in doses that won't disrupt continuity. The question shifts again, not who is guilty, but who is allowed to fall. And more importantly, who is never even considered. That's when discomfort spreads. Because now the conversation isn't emotional. It's logistical. It's about power math, about risk management, about how narratives are chosen, not discovered. This is why resistance increases when people try to widen the lens. Because a wider lens doesn't just threaten reputations, it threatens predictability. And predictability is what keeps power comfortable. Once unpredictability enters, alliances feel exposed. Histories feel unstable. Silence stops working as a shield and starts feeling like evidence of coordination.
And coordination is harder to defend than denial.
This is the moment the system fears most. Not accusations, not even proof, but sustained attention that refuses to narrow itself. Because sustained attention forces comparison, and comparison reveals inequality. Who was scrutinized? Who was spared? Who was protected by timing instead of truth? That's why narratives are constantly encouraged to move on. New scandals, new outrage, new villains. But something is different now. People aren't moving on as fast. They're circling back, rewatching, re-listening, recontextualizing. And each return strips away another layer of insulation. The story stops being about downfall and starts being about design. And once design is exposed, the system can't pretend it was accidental anymore. There is a cost to speaking that most people never see. It isn't just legal. It's social, economic, psychological. It's the quiet understanding that once you talk, your access changes. Doors close politely. Phones stop ringing. Opportunities drift elsewhere without explanation. And the system doesn't need to threaten anyone for this to work. Everyone already knows the rules. That's why so many stories never make it past whispers. Not because they lack truth, but because truth alone doesn't pay the price of admission. Silence does. Compliance does. Knowing when to look away does. Fear doesn't need proof to function. It only needs plausibility. If you believe speaking up might cost you everything you've built, you don't need certainty. You only need doubt. And doubt is easy to manufacture in environments where power is uneven. This is where the myth of choice breaks down. People ask why more insiders didn't come forward, why more witnesses stayed quiet, why more moments passed without resistance. But those questions assume freedom where there was leverage. Leverage doesn't shout. It lingers. It reminds you of contracts, of relationships, of the long memory of industries that never forget disloyalty. It reminds you that survival often depends less on talent than on positioning, and positioning is fragile. So people learn to speak in half-statements, in careful language, in pauses. They tell parts of stories without finishing them. They hint, they suggest, they let others connect dots they're afraid to draw themselves. Over time, this creates a culture where truth exists in fragments. Everyone knows a piece. No one holds the whole. And because no single voice carries everything, responsibility dissolves. That dissolution isn't accidental. It's protection through diffusion. When everyone knows something, no one is accountable for saying it. And that's why moments like this feel different. Because suddenly, fragments are being placed together. Not by one person, but by collective attention, by timelines, by comparison, by memory that refuses to stay compartmentalized. Once that happens, fear changes shape. It no longer belongs only to those who might speak. It starts belonging to those who relied on silence, to those who assumed time would erase context, to those who believed loyalty would outlast scrutiny. The balance shifts. Speaking still carries risk, but silence starts carrying it too. And that's when systems become unstable. Because they were built on the assumption that fear flowed in one direction, that consequences were reserved for disruption, not for maintenance. When that assumption breaks, everything feels exposed. The most dangerous moment for any system isn't when someone speaks loudly. It's when many people quietly realize they were never as alone as they thought. Because fear thrives in isolation. And isolation collapses the moment patterns are shared. When patterns are finally shared, the story stops belonging to any one voice. It becomes collective. That's when narratives lose their power to control outcomes. Not because accusations increase, but because context multiplies. One account echoes another. One timeline aligns with the next. And suddenly, what once felt risky to say feels risky to ignore. This is where systems begin to fracture, not through confrontation, but through exposure to their own design. The same structures that once protected influence start revealing how dependent they were on quiet cooperation. The same strategies that delayed accountability now make delay itself suspicious. And suspicion doesn't need proof to spread. It needs repetition. Every time a familiar defense appears, people recognize it. Every time silence follows pressure, it's noted. Every time attention is redirected, the redirection itself becomes the story. The audience is no longer passive. They've learned the rhythm. They know when outrage is being contained, when complexity is being avoided, when a conversation is being steered away from uncomfortable intersections. And once that awareness settles in, the old tools stop working. This is why institutions struggle when narratives decentralize. There's no single statement to refute, no single claim to disprove, no single person to discredit. The story exists across interviews, documents, past behavior, and present reaction.
We have to find
it lives
somebody
in
that'll work with us
comparison,
that has
not
dealt in
accusation.
the dirtiest of dirty business.
And comparison
We're losing.
is relentless. It doesn't forget timelines. It doesn't respect reputations. It doesn't care how long someone has been untouchable. It simply asks whether things add up. When they don't, discomfort spreads upward. That's the moment when control slips, not publicly, but internally. Strategies become reactive. Messaging tightens. Silence grows heavier. And the confidence that once came from predictability begins to erode. Because predictability depends on people behaving the same way forever. And they don't. Audiences evolve. Media shifts. Memory sharpens. What once disappeared now resurfaces instantly. What once required courage now requires attention. And attention, once focused, is hard to redirect. The system senses this before anyone says it out loud. It senses that the old cycle isn't closing cleanly, that this time the story isn't resolving into a single ending, that it's branching. And branching narratives are dangerous. They invite new questions instead of closure. They pull in voices that were never meant to speak together. They connect moments that were designed to remain separate. This is no longer about exposing individuals. It's about exposing how much effort it took to keep everything else hidden. And once people understand the effort, they start asking who paid for it. At this stage, the story stops asking for belief and starts demanding examination. Not of rumors, but of responses. Not of allegations, but of behavior. Because when pressure arrives, truth doesn't always reveal itself in words. It reveals itself in choices. Who speaks? Who pauses? Who distances themselves quietly? Who stays exactly where they are? These choices form a language of their own. Watch how narratives tighten when questions broaden. Watch how statements become smaller as scrutiny becomes larger. Watch how certainty fades into caution. None of this is accidental. It's adaptive behavior from systems that sense risk. The most revealing moments are rarely explosive. They're subtle. A sentence that avoids a name. A timeline that skips a year. A defense that answers a different question than the one asked. These gaps matter. They matter because they show where pressure is being applied. They show which areas are sensitive. They show where history feels unstable enough to avoid. And avoidance leaves fingerprints. For a long time, accountability was treated as an event. Something dramatic. Something final. A courtroom moment. A verdict. But accountability is actually a process. Slow. Uncomfortable. Relentless. It builds when questions don't go away. When stories are revisited instead of replaced. When context is added instead of erased. When silence is noticed instead of respected. This is the phase where reputations feel heavier than ever. Because weight comes not from attack, but from accumulation. Every unanswered question adds mass. Every deflection adds tension. and tension demands resolution. But resolution doesn't always mean confession or collapse. Sometimes it means exposure of limits, of how far influence can stretch before it snaps, of how long silence can hold before it fractures. The audience is no longer asking for drama. They're asking for coherence. They want timelines that align, explanations that don't contradict, defenses that hold up under repetition. And repetition is unforgiving. Say something once and it might pass. Say it again years later and it's tested. Say it a third time and it's measured against everything that's changed. That's when stories evolve from statements into records. Records don't argue. They wait. They sit there while narratives shift around them, while reputations rise and fall, while attention moves elsewhere. And then, when the moment is right, they resurface.
Stronger than before.
Because now they're not alone. They're supported by patterns, by behavior, by the absence of things that should have been said. This is where power realizes that the old rules aren't working the same way anymore. Not because people are angrier, but because they're paying attention longer. And attention, sustained and focused, is the one thing no system ever fully controls. Every story like this reaches a point where it can no longer hide behind speculation. Not because all the answers are known, but because the questions have matured. What began as noise has become a record. What once relied on memory now relies on comparison. And what was protected by time is now exposed by it.
This is where the illusion breaks.
Power survives on the belief that attention is temporary, that outrage fades, that people forget, that silence, if held long enough, becomes history. But history isn't fixed. It's revised every time new context enters the frame. And context has entered, not as accusation, as structure. Structure shows how influence moved, how protection formed, how narratives were shaped and reshaped to preserve continuity. It reveals that accountability was never absent. It was managed through distance, through silence, through selective focus. That management worked because people trusted the process without seeing it. They trusted that what was visible was complete. They trusted that what wasn't addressed didn't matter. That trust is gone. In its place is something quieter and far more dangerous to unchecked power: sustained scrutiny. Scrutiny that doesn't demand conclusions, but demands consistency. Scrutiny that doesn't attack individuals, but examines systems. Scrutiny that isn't satisfied by endings, because it understands how endings are manufactured. The most important shift isn't happening in courtrooms or headlines. It's happening in how audiences listen. They're no longer consuming stories. They're evaluating them. They're noticing what's repeated, what's avoided, what's defended too carefully, what's never addressed at all. And once that lens is adopted, it doesn't switch off. This story doesn't claim to know everything. It doesn't declare verdicts. It doesn't reduce complexity into comfort. What it does is refuse to look away from patterns just because they're inconvenient. Because the truth isn't always explosive. Sometimes it's structural. Sometimes it's the realization that silence wasn't accidental, that access wasn't neutral, that loyalty wasn't free. Sometimes it's understanding that the system didn't fail.
We have to find
It
somebody
worked exactly as designed, and now that design is visible. What happens next isn't about downfall or redemption. It's about whether accountability remains an event or finally becomes a process. Because once people see how power was protected, they start asking who else benefited. And that question doesn't end here. It only gets sharper.